Something enormous once ruled this planet, yet we barely know it. Welcome. Today we step quietly into one of Earth's deepest riddles. Dinosaurs, not as movie monsters, but as living, breathing animals whose stories are still unfolding. Why does this matter? Because every fossil reshapes what we think we understand about life, survival, and even ourselves. Recent discoveries in paleontology reveal details so unexpected they challenge long-held beliefs about feathers, behavior, intelligence, and extinction. If we are willing to look closely, the past becomes a guide to curiosity and resilience. Take a steady breath, bring your questions, and let's begin this journey into the unknown. Picture this for just a second. You're standing in the middle of a giant museum. You're looking up at a massive skeleton towering above you. Its bones are yellowed and old. Its empty eye sockets stare down at nothing. And somewhere deep in your chest, you feel something. Maybe a little bit of wonder, maybe a little bit of fear, maybe just the quiet sense that you are staring at something impossibly ancient and impossibly real. Now, here is the question nobody asks in that moment. What if that skeleton is lying to you? Not on purpose, not because the scientist did anything wrong, but because bones are just the beginning of the story, and for a very long time we convinced ourselves that bones were the whole story. What if everything you learned about dinosaurs in school was wrong? And we are not talking about small details here. We are not talking about getting a date slightly off or mispronouncing a name. We are talking about the color, the texture, the sound, the smell, the intelligence, the family life, the emotions, the entire living, breathing, moving, calling, caring reality of these animals. We got almost all of it wrong. And the truth, the actual, scientifically supported, jaw-dropping truth, is so much more beautiful, so much more strange, and honestly, so much more exciting than anything any movie has ever shown you. Before this video is over, you are going to learn that some dinosaurs had lips, and that when they closed their mouths, they looked almost calm. You are going to learn that some dinosaurs were pink, or iridescent blue, or striped like a zebra, and we know this because the color information survived inside fossilized feathers for over 100 million years. You are going to learn that one species of dinosaur may have been intelligent enough that, given another 65 million years of evolution, it might have looked something like us. And you are going to learn a final fact at the very end of this video, a single, simple fact about time that will completely change the way you think about every dinosaur you've ever seen. So stay with us, because this is not your elementary school dinosaur lesson. This is the real story, and it is just getting started. Chapter 1. The planet was alien. Before we can talk about dinosaurs, we need to talk about the world they lived in. Because here is the thing. It was not our world, not even close. Forget every map you have ever seen. Forget the continents, the oceans, the mountain ranges, the familiar shapes of North America and Europe and Asia. None of that existed when dinosaurs first walked this earth. What existed instead was something scientists call Pangaea, which is a Greek word that roughly means all the earth. And that name is exactly right, because Pangaea was one single enormous unbroken landmass sitting in the middle of a planet that was mostly covered in water. Think about what that means for a moment. An animal born in what would one day become Montana could, if it walked long enough, reach what would one day become China. There were no oceans in the way, no barriers. Just one giant, continuous piece of land stretching from pole to pole, surrounded by one vast ancient sea. And the air itself was different from what we breathe today. The oxygen levels in the atmosphere were noticeably higher than they are right now, and that changes everything. Higher oxygen means that fires started more easily and burned more intensely, which shaped the landscape in dramatic ways. It means that insects, which breathe through tiny tubes in their bodies, could grow to sizes that would seem impossible today. Giant dragonflies with wingspans wider than a hawk. Millipedes as long as a grown man is tall. The world was bigger in every way, and breathing that ancient air today would feel genuinely strange. Scientists believe that the richer atmosphere would make you feel more alert, more energized, almost buzzing with extra vitality. Your muscles would work more efficiently. Your mind would feel sharper. It would be, in a very real sense, like breathing something slightly magical. The sky above this ancient world was sometimes painted in warm orange and amber tones, caused by the different composition of the atmosphere and the higher frequency of volcanic activity. The oceans were warmer than they are today, glowing in shades of blue and green that no living human has ever seen. And at the poles, the places where today there is nothing but permanent ice and frozen silence, there were forests. Actual, living green forests, full of ancient trees and ferns and creatures going about their lives in the endless polar summer. This was not the cold, grey, muddy world that old paintings and old movies showed us. This was a planet absolutely soaked in life, drenched in colour, buzzing with noise. It was wild and warm and strange and beautiful. And for a very long time, no dinosaurs lived in it at all. For most of Earth's early history, the dominant land animals were not dinosaurs. They were strange creatures called archosaurs and therapsids, names that most people have never heard. And they ruled the world for a long, long time. Dinosaurs were nowhere to be found. And they would not appear until the world had gone through something so catastrophic, so complete, and so terrible that it reshaped the entire story of life on this planet. But before we get to that catastrophe, just sit with this image for a moment. Imagine standing on the shore of that ancient, single supercontinent, watching the orange sky reflect off an ancient, warm sea. Somewhere in the forest behind you, something large is moving. Something that has never been given a name, because no human will exist to name it for another 240 million years. The air is thick and rich and perfect. The world is young, and it is about to go through a nightmare from which nothing will ever fully recover. Chapter 2, How Dinosaurs Actually Began Here, is something that surprises almost everyone when they first hear it. Dinosaurs were not the original rulers of this planet. They were not the first great animals, and they were not even the most powerful creatures of their time when they first showed up. Dinosaurs were, in the truest sense of the word, underdogs. And they only got their chance because the world was handed to them on a plate of ash and destruction. 252 million years ago, before a single dinosaur had ever taken a breath, something happened that makes every natural disaster in recorded human history look like a minor inconvenience. Scientists call it the Permian-Triassic extinction event, but most people who study it just call it the Great Dying. And that name is earned. In a geological blink of an eye, which in this case means roughly 60,000 years, which is still an incomprehensibly long time by human standards, 96% of all life on Earth was erased. Not weakened, not reduced, erased, gone. The oceans turned acidic as volcanic gases dissolved into the seawater and essentially turned the seas into a very weak acid bath. The atmosphere filled with carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide from volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia. Eruptions so massive and so sustained that they lasted for nearly 1 million years, pumping poison into the sky without stopping. The temperature on the surface of the planet spiked dramatically. The food chains that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build collapsed. The coral reefs died, the forest burned, the rivers filled with sediment from the eroding, lifeless land. And on the floor of the ancient ocean, where the acid had killed nearly everything, the sediment settled into layers of rock that geologists can still read today like a diary of the apocalypse. 4 out of every 5 species of land animals simply ceased to exist. 96 out of every 100 species in the ocean, gone. The world was not just damaged, it was emptied, a full reset. And yet life survived. Because life is remarkably, stubbornly, almost impossibly difficult to completely kill. A handful of creatures clung on, small things mostly, animals that could hide underground or in deep water or in the narrow cracks between disaster and survival. They were not impressive, they were not powerful, they were just lucky and adaptable, and that was enough. And from those survivors, over millions and millions of years of slow, patient recovery, new animals emerged. And among those new animals, small, light, fast, and hungry, were the very first dinosaurs. Now, here is the part that really matters, because it completely reframes how we should think about these animals. Dinosaurs did not conquer a healthy, thriving world. They inherited a shattered one. They rose to dominance not because they were necessarily the best animals ever designed, but because the world had been so thoroughly destroyed that almost nothing was left to compete with them. They were the survivors of a catastrophe, filling an emptiness that nothing else was around to fill. The very first dinosaur we know of was an animal called Eoraptor, which means dawn thief, and it lived in what is now Argentina roughly 231 million years ago. And if you saw one today, you would probably not be very impressed. It was about the size of a Labrador dog. It walked on 2 legs and ran with a light, quick gait. It ate insects and small animals. It had sharp little teeth and quick reflexes, and absolutely nothing about it would have suggested it was the ancestor of creatures that would one day shake the ground with every footstep. But it survived. And its descendants survived. And their descendants survived. And generation by generation, over millions of years, the lineage of Eoraptor grew and diversified and spread across every corner of Pangaea, filling every ecological role available to them. Hunters, plant-eaters, swimmers, climbers, runners, and eventually flyers. For a long time after their first appearance, dinosaurs were just one of many animal types sharing the world. They were not special. They were not particularly large or powerful. They were simply a little bit better than everything else at the single most important skill in nature, surviving long enough to have children. And slowly, quietly, with no fanfare and no dramatic moment, the world began to tilt in their favour. By the end of the Triassic period, roughly 200 million years ago, dinosaurs were the dominant land animals on Earth. Not because they fought for it, not because they were destined for it, but because they were extraordinarily good at simply being alive. And for the next 165 million years, they would prove it every single day. Chapter 3: Feathers, Colours, and the Greatest Mistake in Paleontology. All right, it is time to talk about the biggest visual lie that has ever been told in the history of science. And we say that with kindness because the people who got this wrong were doing their absolute best with what they had. But the fact remains, every single dinosaur illustration you grew up with was wrong. Every poster on every classroom wall, every toy in every toy store, every movie that has ever been made, the grey-green, scaly, smooth-skinned reptile monsters that defined our image of dinosaurs for 150 years, those animals never actually existed. We invented them, and the real animals were so spectacularly, breathtakingly different that it still takes people a moment to fully absorb the truth. Here is how the mistake happened, and honestly, it is an understandable one. When the first paleontologists started digging up dinosaur bones in the 1800s, they compared them to the living animals they knew best. Lizards, crocodiles, large reptiles. And large reptiles, as you know, are scaly and smooth and generally come in shades of green and brown and grey. So the assumption was natural and logical. Dinosaurs were probably the same. For over a century, nobody questioned this seriously. Artists painted dinosaurs as giant scaly lizards, and those images became so familiar, so deeply embedded in our cultural understanding of these animals, that even when scientists started privately suspecting something different, the popular image refused to change. The movies kept the scales, the toys kept the scales, the museums kept the scales. Because that was what dinosaurs looked like. Everyone knew that. Then China changed everything. In the 1990s, farmers in a rural region of northeastern China called Liaoning started finding fossils that were unlike anything scientists had seen before. The rock there was an extremely fine-grained volcanic sediment that had settled very slowly into ancient lakes, and it had a remarkable property. It preserved soft tissue, not just bones, not just teeth. The actual physical impressions of soft structures that would normally decay and disappear within weeks of an animal dying. And what those structures showed, on fossil after fossil after fossil, was feathers. Real, complex, layered feathers on dinosaurs. Not just on small bird-like species, on large, predatory theropods that nobody had ever suspected of having a single feather anywhere. The paleontology community did not take this calmly. There was excitement, yes, but also resistance. Some scientists argued the feathers were a unique feature of these particular Chinese species and did not apply broadly. Others argued they were not true feathers, but something more primitive. The debate was heated and occasionally personal, the way debates get when they threaten to overturn a century of established thinking. But the fossils kept coming, and the evidence kept building. And today, the scientific consensus is clear and essentially uncontested. Feathers were not rare among dinosaurs. They were extraordinarily common, probably universal, among a large and important group called the theropods, which includes Velociraptor, Spinosaurus, Allosaurus, and yes, very likely, Tyrannosaurus rex itself. Your T-Rex had feathers, at least on parts of its body, possibly over most of its body when it was young. The most fearsome predator in the popular imagination. The creature that has starred in blockbuster movies and haunted children's nightmares for generations, looked, at least in part, like an enormous, terrifying bird. But the feather discovery, as stunning as it was only the beginning. Because the next question was obvious. What colour were the feathers? And for a while, scientists assumed this was simply unknowable. Colour does not fossilize. The pigment molecules that give a feather its hue break down and disappear over time. So even with all these beautifully preserved feather impressions, scientists assumed the actual colours were lost forever. Then, in the year 2010, a team of researchers made a discovery that was so unexpected, so genuinely thrilling, that it spread through the scientific community like wildfire. They found, preserved inside fossilized feathers, tiny microscopic structures called melanosomes. Melanosomes are small organelles found inside cells that produce and store colour pigments. And the astonishing thing, the thing that still feels almost miraculous, is that the shape of a melanosome tells you what colour pigment it stored. Spherical melanosomes produce black and dark brown pigments. Elongated, rod-shaped melanosomes produce reddish-brown and russet tones. And by mapping the distribution of different melanosome shapes across a fossilized feather, scientists could, for the very first time in history, look at a creature that had been dead for 100 million years and say with genuine scientific confidence, this part was black, this part was reddish-brown. This part had an iridescent, metallic sheen, like the throat of a hummingbird in sunlight. The first species to be fully reconstructed in colour from this method was a small, crow-sized dinosaur called Anchiornis, and when the colour reconstruction was published, it was genuinely beautiful. A black and white body with reddish-brown highlights on the face and crest. Bold and striking, and nothing like any grey lizard anyone had ever imagined. Since then, more and more species have been reconstructed, and what has emerged is a picture of the dinosaur world that is stunningly, vividly colourful. Some dinosaurs had iridescent feathers that would have shimmered in sunlight. Some had bold stripes. Some had bright patches of colour on their faces and crests that would have been unmistakable from a distance. And the reason for all this colour is exactly the same reason a peacock has a magnificent tail, or a poison dart frog is neon red. Dinosaurs were communicating, they were competing, They were attracting mates and warning rivals and expressing their status in a world of constant social negotiation. These were not dull, mindless monsters shambling through a grey world. They were alive in every sense of the word. They were vivid and social and expressive. They were beautiful. And the world they moved through was as colourful and alive as any tropical rainforest today. Every time you see an old painting of a grey dinosaur, just remember, that is not what they looked like. The real version was better. Much, much better. Chapter 4. They had lips and warm blood and so much more. In the year 2023, a group of scientists published a research paper that broke the internet for paleontology fans and confused pretty much everyone else. The headline was 3 words long, and those 3 words were enough to completely upend one of the most iconic images in all of popular culture. Tyrannosaurus rex had lips, not big, fleshy, human-style lips, but lips in the biological sense. A soft tissue covering over the teeth that kept them moist and protected when the mouth was closed. The kind of lips you see on a modern monitor lizard. The kind that make a large reptile look relatively calm and unremarkable when it is not actively trying to eat something. Think about every single image of a T-Rex you have ever seen. Every movie poster, every museum display, every birthday cake and Halloween costume and children's book illustration. In almost all of them, the teeth are always visible. The jaw is slightly open, or even when it is closed, you can still see those enormous, terrifying, serrated teeth because the lips, or rather the absence of lips, leave them permanently exposed and snarling. That image is wrong. When Tyrannosaurus rex closed its mouth, its teeth were hidden, covered. The expression on its face was, by the standard of theropod dinosaurs, actually relatively neutral. Not calm exactly, because it was still a 9-ton killing machine with the most powerful bite in land animal history, but not the permanent, sneering, toothy monster of 100 movie posters either. The evidence for lips came from several directions simultaneously. Researchers pointed out that animals with exposed teeth, like crocodiles, have teeth that are constantly wet because they sit in or near water, and the saliva and moisture from the environment keeps the enamel healthy. Land animals with large, complex teeth and no access to constant moisture would suffer severe enamel degradation if those teeth were left exposed to air for their entire lives. T-Rex teeth show no such degradation. Conclusion: they were covered. Additionally, the bone structure around the T-Rex jaw showed tiny holes called foramina, pathways for blood vessels and nerves, arranged in a pattern consistent with a soft tissue covering, not with permanently exposed bone. This might seem like a small detail in the grand scheme of things, but scientists will tell you it matters enormously, because lips tell us something about the animal beyond just its appearance. Animals with lips tend to be more facially expressive. They use their mouths and faces as tools of social communication in ways that permanently toothed animals cannot. Lips suggest a creature that was, in some sense, showing you things with its face. Now, while we are rethinking the basic biology of these animals, let us talk about something even more fundamental. For most of the 20th century, paleontologists believed that dinosaurs, like modern reptiles, were cold-blooded. This is a term that most people understand to mean slow, sluggish, dependent on external heat, and generally not very lively. Cold-blooded animals have to warm up in the morning sun before they can move quickly. They struggle in cold weather. Their metabolism runs slowly, and they spend a lot of their time doing essentially nothing. For a long time, this seemed like a reasonable description of dinosaurs. They were reptiles, after all. Reptiles are cold-blooded, simple. But then the evidence started piling up in ways that just did not fit. Dinosaurs grew extraordinarily fast, at rates that are frankly impossible for cold-blooded animals. The growth rings in their bones, which work like tree rings and show how fast an animal grew each year, revealed growth spurts that matched warm-blooded mammals, not reptiles. Dinosaur fossils were found in polar regions, places that would have been simply too cold for a cold-blooded animal to survive for any extended period. And the structure of dinosaur bone itself, its density, its texture, its vascular complexity, looked far more like mammal bone than reptile bone when examined under a microscope. Today, the scientific consensus has shifted enormously from where it was even 30 years ago. Most dinosaurs were probably warm-blooded, or something in between, a unique metabolic system that scientists sometimes call mesothermy, which sits between the cold-blooded metabolism of reptiles and the fully warm-blooded system of mammals and birds. Some larger dinosaurs may have been what is called gigantotherms. Their bodies were so large that they retained heat simply through their bulk, the way a large rock stays warm well after the sun goes down. But whatever the exact metabolic system, the implication is the same. The dinosaur world was not the slow, lazy, basking in the sun world that old movies depicted. It was active, it was energetic, it was alive at all hours, in all temperatures, in all seasons. Dinosaurs were not waiting for the sun to warm them up before they could function. They were already running. And when you combine warm-bloodedness with feathers, which are, among other things, an excellent form of insulation, you start to see a picture of an animal that could thrive in a remarkable range of environments and conditions. Not just the warm tropical swamps of old illustrations, but cold forests, high altitudes, and seasonal climates. Dinosaurs were not fragile, heat-dependent creatures. They were robust, adaptable, and built for the long haul. Chapter 5. Size. The truth about the biggest and the smallest. When most Americans think about dinosaurs, they think about big, huge, impossibly cartoonishly large. And it is true that some dinosaurs achieve sizes that no other land animals in the entire history of life have ever matched. But here is the thing that surprises almost everyone. Most dinosaurs were not big at all. The average dinosaur, if you took every known species and worked out the middle, was roughly the size of a large dog or a turkey. Many were smaller than a house cat. For every lumbering giant that shook the ground, there were dozens of small, quick, lightweight species darting through the undergrowth, chasing insects, nesting in trees, and living lives more similar to modern birds than to anything most people picture when they hear the word dinosaur. But the ones that were big? Oh, they were something else entirely. Patagotitan majorum was discovered in Argentina in the year 2014, and it holds the current record for the largest land animal we have ever found evidence of. It was roughly 37 meters long, from nose to tail, longer than a full-size blue whale. It weighed approximately 70 tons. When it placed one foot on the ground, the force of that single footstep was enough to leave an impression in solid rock that scientists can still find and measure today. To try to make that size feel real for a moment, its heart was the size of a small car. Its neck alone was 12 meters long enough that the animal's head was roughly as high off the ground as the roof of a 3-story building. A single vertebra from its backbone, one bone from the middle of its spine, was larger than an average adult human being. You could not lift it. You could barely wrap your arms around it. And feeding a body that size required a level of constant, dedicated eating that is genuinely hard to imagine. Scientists estimate that Patagotitan needed to consume around 300 pounds of plant material every single day just to maintain its body weight. Not to grow, not to recover from injury or illness, just to stay alive at the exact same size. That means the animals spent virtually every waking hour eating, walking from one cluster of ancient trees to the next, pulling down branches and stripping leaves with a methodical efficiency that never stopped from sunrise to sunset. The mechanics of how this enormous body actually worked are still being studied. The heart had to pump blood up that 12-meter neck to reach the brain, which required blood pressure so high that in a human it would be instantly fatal. Scientists believe the sauropod cardiovascular system had special valves and mechanisms to manage this pressure, though the exact details remain a subject of active research. The lungs had to supply oxygen to a body the size of a small building. The digestive system had to process hundreds of pounds of vegetation daily. Every organ in that body was solving an engineering problem that nature had never faced before and has never faced since. Now flip to the other end of the size spectrum. There was a dinosaur called Microraptor that weighed about as much as a large crow and had not 2 wings but 4. One pair on its arms and one pair on its legs. And it probably glided between trees the way a flying squirrel does today. It was discovered in China, and it was so small and so strange that when scientists first described it, there was a genuine debate about whether it was even a dinosaur at all. It was. It was just a dinosaur that had decided, evolutionarily speaking, that being small and aerial was a much better life strategy than being enormous and earthbound. And then there was Compsognathus, which was for a very long time incorrectly famous as the smallest known dinosaur. It was about the size of a chicken. It had long, slender legs built for speed. It had sharp little teeth and agile hands. And despite its modest size, it was almost certainly a capable, aggressive predator, fast enough to catch lizards and insects, smart enough to hunt opportunistically, and probably confident enough in groups to tackle prey larger than itself. But the most mind-bending size story in all of dinosaur science is not about the biggest or the smallest. It is about what happened in the middle. Because the dinosaurs that eventually became birds did something almost without precedent in the history of evolution. They shrank. Over millions of years, generation by generation, a lineage of theropod dinosaurs became progressively smaller, lighter and more agile, developing hollow bones and enlarged brains and refined feathers along the way, until they crossed some invisible biological threshold and true powered flight became possible. Giant, earth-shaking dinosaurs, animals that could shake the ground and block out the sun, compressed themselves over deep time into creatures small enough to sit on your hand. The sky above your head is full of their descendants right now. Every robin, every sparrow, every hawk circling lazily on a thermal current is a living testament to the most dramatic size reduction in vertebrate history. When you look up and see a bird, you're not just seeing a bird. You're seeing the end result of a 160 million year journey from the enormous to the exquisite. Chapter 6. Rethinking dinosaur brains. For most of the 20th century, dinosaurs were the go-to example of stupidity in the natural world. The phrase pea-brained became practically synonymous with them. Science textbooks showed the ratio of brain size to body size, something called the encephalization quotient. And dinosaurs consistently came out near the bottom. The classic example was always Stegosaurus, a bus-sized animal, armoured and dramatic, with a brain the size of a walnut. And then there was the story that became famous enough to make it into nearly every dinosaur book ever written for children. Scientists claimed that Stegosaurus had a second brain, a second neural mass located in its hip region, because its actual brain was so tiny that it needed help running the back half of its body. This story was repeated for decades. Teachers taught it. Parents passed it along. It became one of those facts that feels so strange and specific that it just has to be true. It was not true. The structure in the hip that scientists mistook for a second brain was a cavity, a space in the bone likely filled with glycogen, which is a form of stored energy and possibly nervous tissue that coordinated certain reflexes in the lower body. Important, yes. A second brain, no. We repeated a completely invented story in classrooms for 80 years, and most people still believe it today. But let us set Stegosaurus aside for a moment and talk about the dinosaurs that genuinely do raise interesting questions about intelligence. Let us talk about Velociraptor. The velociraptors in the Jurassic Park movies are famously depicted as highly intelligent, problem-solving, cooperative hunters, animals smart enough to test electric fences for weaknesses, coordinate complex attacks in small groups, and eventually, in one memorable scene, open a door. Everyone laughed at this. Everyone knew the filmmakers had exaggerated for effect. Here is the part that nobody talks about enough. They were not wrong by as much as most people assume. Real velociraptors were not as large as the movie versions. The film actually depicted a different, larger species called Deinonychus. But their brain structure was genuinely impressive by dinosaur standards. Velociraptors had brain-to-body ratios that were comparable to modern birds of prey, like hawks and falcons. Their olfactory bulbs, the brain regions devoted to processing smell, were large and highly developed, suggesting an acute and sophisticated sense of smell. Their visual processing areas were well developed, and the part of the brain responsible for coordination, balance and precise movement, the cerebellum, was proportionally enormous, suggesting the kind of rapid, agile, precise motion you would expect from a fast-moving predator making split-second decisions in complex environments. Were they as intelligent as the movie suggested? Probably not quite. But were they dumb? Absolutely not. They were, by the standards of their time, sharp, observant, responsive, and almost certainly capable of more complex behavior than we give them credit for. But the dinosaur that genuinely makes some paleontologists a little bit uneasy when they think about it too carefully is one that most people have never heard of. It was called Troodon, and it lived in North America during the late Cretaceous period, roughly 75 million years ago. Troodon had the highest brain-to-body ratio of any non-avian dinosaur that has ever been found. It had large forward-facing eyes that gave it three-dimensional vision. The kind of visual system that is associated with animals that need to judge distance and depth precisely. Typically hunters that need to see exactly where their prey is in space before making a move. Its hands were capable, and its body was built for both speed and maneuverability. In the year 1982, a Canadian paleontologist named Dale Russell conducted a thought experiment that became famous and somewhat controversial in scientific circles. He asked a simple but genuinely strange question. If Troodon had not gone extinct 66 million years ago, if the asteroid had missed or hit somewhere else, or the mass extinction had somehow not happened, what might Troodon have become over the next 65 million years of continued evolution? His answer, worked out with genuine scientific rigor, was deeply unsettling. He concluded that Troodon's descendants might have evolved towards something roughly humanoid, bipedal, like their ancestors, but with a much larger brain case. Forward-facing eyes in a flatter face. Larger hands capable of fine manipulation. He created a model of this hypothetical creature and called it the Dinosauroid, and photographs of it have been making people deeply uncomfortable ever since. Scientists disagree about whether this scenario was plausible. Evolution is far less predictable than Russell's model implies, and there is no guarantee that intelligence was the direction natural selection would have taken. But the deeper point is real. Troodon was genuinely, measurably, surprisingly intelligent. And it raises a question that is worth sitting with. On a planet where dinosaurs survived, what might intelligence have looked like 65 million years from now? We will never know. But the question is not as silly as it sounds. What we do know is that across many dinosaur species, we see clear evidence of behaviors that require genuine cognitive capacity. Parental care, looking after eggs, feeding young in nests, staying close to offspring through early development requires memory, planning, and emotional attachment in ways that pure instinct cannot explain. Herding and migration require navigation, spatial memory, and social coordination. Evidence of play behavior in juvenile dinosaurs found in some fossil sites suggests the kind of exploratory learning that characterizes intelligent animals across many different lineages. These were not the mindless robotic killing machines of old movies. They were animals with inner lives complex, dynamic, socially embedded inner lives that we are only beginning to understand. And the more we look, the more we find. Chapter 7. Communication, Sound, and the Lost Voices of Dinosaurs. Close your eyes for just a moment and try to imagine standing in a forest 80 million years ago. Not the cold, grey, foggy world of old science fiction, but a warm, lush, impossibly green forest full of ancient ferns and flowering plants. Yes, flowering plants, because they appeared during the Cretaceous period. And the air is thick and warm and full of the smell of something slightly different from anything you have ever breathed. Now, what do you hear? Most people, if they have grown up watching movies, would say roars. Deep, thunderous, chest-vibrating roars that carry for miles. The iconic sound of the Jurassic Park T-Rex. The howl of the predators in countless adventure movies. That sound that says, unmistakably, something enormous and dangerous is near. Here is the gentle but firm truth. Those roars are almost certainly fictional. And the real sounds of the dinosaur world, while different from what the movies gave us, were in many ways more interesting and more haunting. The evidence comes from the living relatives of dinosaurs. Modern birds, which, as we will explore in detail later, are actual living dinosaurs, do not roar. They chirp, call, sing, screech, whistle, and produce an enormous variety of complex, often beautiful sounds, but roaring is not in their repertoire. And modern crocodilians, and the other living relatives of dinosaurs, sharing a common ancestry that goes back to the same ancient lineage, do not roar either. They bellow, they hiss, they produce deep, resonant rumbles that vibrate the water around them. But they do not roar in the way movies have always portrayed large dinosaurs. Scientists now believe that large dinosaurs most likely produce sounds through a closed-mouth method, a deep, resonant vibration produced inside the body and felt as much as heard, similar to what a large pigeon does when it coos, scaled up to an almost incomprehensible size. These sounds would have been extremely low frequency, well below the threshold of what is comfortable for human hearing, but absolutely detectable to other large animals. They would have travelled for extraordinary distances through dense forest, bouncing off ancient trees and echoing across wide river valleys. A herd of large dinosaurs communicating this way would have created a sound environment that was more felt than heard, a constant, deep physical presence in the air. And then there was the case of Parasaurolophus, which is simply one of the most remarkable stories in all of dinosaur science. Parasaurolophus was a large, plant-eating dinosaur, a hadrosaur, commonly called a duck-billed dinosaur, that lived during the late Cretaceous period. It walked on two legs when needed, but often moved on all four. It was not the most dramatic-looking dinosaur in terms of size or weaponry. But it had something that set it apart from almost every other animal that has ever lived. A spectacular, backward-curving hollow crest running from the tip of its snout all the way up and back over its head, in some species reaching nearly 2 meters in total length. For decades, scientists debated what this crest was for. Was it a snorkel, allowing the animal to breathe while its head was underwater? Tests showed the tube did not open at the end, so that idea was abandoned. Was it a weapon? too fragile and hollow. Was it for temperature regulation? Possibly, but that seemed like a lot of evolutionary investment for a simple thermostat. Then, in the 1990s, a team of scientists had an elegantly simple idea. They made a precise physical model of the internal tube structure of the Parasaurolophus crest and blew air through it. And the sound that came out stopped everyone in the room. It was a deep, resonant, mournful horn, something between a foghorn and a trombone, a sound with complex harmonics and a haunting quality that seemed to carry emotional weight, even though it had been produced by a machine imitating the anatomy of an animal that died 75 million years ago. The sound was clearly, unmistakably designed to carry, designed to communicate across distances, designed to be heard. Parasaurolophus was a musician. Its entire skull was a musical instrument, shaped by millions of years of evolution to produce a specific, recognizable call. And since we have fossil evidence of Parasaurolophus living in large herds, sometimes hundreds or thousands of individuals together, the implication is extraordinary. A herd of Parasaurolophus communicating with their crests would have created a symphony, a deep, rolling, echoing chorus that would have filled entire river valleys. A sound that no human ear has heard in 66 million years, but that was at one time perfectly ordinary background music for the late Cretaceous world. Sound was not the only channel of communication, of course. We now know that many dinosaurs were visually flamboyant, that colour and display were central to their social lives. Crests, fanned feathers, bright patches of skin, iridescent surfaces. All of these were signals in a constant visual conversation. Which animals were healthy, which were dominant, which were ready to mate, which were warning rivals to back off. The dinosaur world was not silent and grey. It was loud and colourful and communicative and alive. It was, in its own ancient way, full of personality. Chapter 8. T-Rex, the truth behind the most famous animal in history. Let us talk about the most famous predator in the history of life on this planet. Let us talk about Tyrannosaurus rex. And let us agree right at the start to be completely honest about it. Because T-Rex is not just the most famous dinosaur. It is possibly the most famous animal that has ever existed, in the sense that virtually every human being on Earth, in almost every culture, in almost every language, knows what Tyrannosaurus rex is. Children recognize it before they can reliably spell their own names. It has generated more merchandise, more movies, more toys, and more scientific papers than any other extinct creature in history. And it has also been more consistently misrepresented than almost any animal in the history of science. We have already talked about the lips, we have already talked about the feathers. But there is so much more to set straight, and it is worth going through it carefully, because the real T-Rex is in many ways more fascinating than the fictional version. Start with the arms. Those short, seemingly useless little arms have been the source of endless jokes for generations. Here is this 12 to 13 metre long, 8 to 9 ton apex predator, and its arms look like they belong on a much, much smaller animal. They cannot reach its mouth. They cannot reach each other. They look, in every conventional sense, ridiculous. But here is what those arms could actually do. Each arm was roughly 1 meter long and attached to a shoulder and chest musculature that was genuinely massive. Scientific studies of T-Rex arm bones have estimated that each arm could curl, in the bicep curl sense, over 400 pounds of force. That is not impressive by T-Rex scale, but it is not nothing either. Current thinking suggests the arms were probably used during mating to grip a partner during contact, or possibly to help the animal push itself up from a lying position. A surprisingly difficult task when you weigh 9 tons and your legs are positioned toward the back of your body. They were not useless. They were just specialized for very specific tasks that did not involve looking impressive. Now, let us talk about speed, because this is where expectations consistently get upended. Early estimates of T-Rex running speed went as high as 45 miles per hour. Fast enough to easily run down any human alive and comfortably keep pace with highway traffic. Those numbers were based on early and fairly crude biomechanical models. More recent research, using sophisticated computer modeling of bone structure, muscle attachment points, and the stress loads different body parts could sustain, has revised that number dramatically downward. Current best estimates put T-Rex top speed at somewhere between 10 and 15 miles per hour. That is roughly the pace of a quick human jog. A reasonably fit person running hard might be able to outrun a Tyrannosaurus rex over a short distance. Take a breath. Let that land. But before you start planning your escape route, consider the rest of the picture. T-Rex did not need to be fast. The animals it hunted, Triceratops, Edmontosaurus, Ankylosaurus, were not especially fast either. And T-Rex had essentially unlimited stamina. It could maintain a steady, ground-eating trot for hours. It could follow you all day. It did not need to sprint. It could just keep walking toward you, hour after hour, until you fell over. And its senses. This is where the real terror of Tyrannosaurus rex lives, and this is where it genuinely earns its status as one of the most formidable predators in the history of the world. The sense of smell first. T-Rex had the largest olfactory bulbs, the brain regions dedicated to processing scent, of any predatory animal in the fossil record. In terms of proportion, its olfactory system was larger than almost any living animal, including the famous blood-tracking abilities of dogs. The precise limits are hard to measure from fossils, but scientists estimate that T-Rex could detect blood and organic scent from extraordinary distances under favorable conditions, potentially several miles. Once something was bleeding anywhere in T-Rex territory, T-Rex knew about it. The vision. Forward-facing eyes gave T-Rex binocular vision, the ability to see in 3 dimensions, to judge depth and distance accurately. The binocular field of T-Rex has been estimated to be roughly 13 times wider than a human's. Combined with what appears to have been excellent visual acuity, T-Rex could see you at a very great distance, could judge exactly how far away you were, and could track your movement with remarkable precision. The hearing. T-Rex's inner ear structure suggests it was optimized for detecting low-frequency sounds, the kind produced by large animals moving through vegetation, footsteps on the ground, breathing at a distance. It could hear things that other animals with different hearing ranges might miss entirely. And then, the bite. The mechanical analysis of T-Rex bite force is one of the most stunning numbers in all of natural history. Roughly 57,000 newtons of force. To put that in perspective, a great white shark, widely considered one of the most powerful biters in the ocean, generates about 18,000 newtons. A saltwater crocodile, one of the strongest biters among living reptiles, produces roughly 16,000. T-Rex was approximately 3 to 4 times more powerful than either of those animals. But the truly remarkable thing was what T-Rex did with that bite force. It did not bite around bones, it bit through them. We have found dinosaur bones, large dense bones from prey animals, with T-Rex tooth marks driven deeply into the bone material, not just the surface. In many cases, the bone shows signs of being crushed and fragmented, which allowed the T-Rex to access the marrow inside. T-Rex was not just hunting prey for the meat, it was processing entire animals, including their skeletons, extracting every calorie the body had to offer. There was a famous debate in paleontology for about 20 years over whether T-Rex was primarily a hunter or primarily a scavenger, whether it killed its own prey or relied on stealing the kills of smaller predators and feeding on already dead carcasses. The argument for scavenging had some compelling points. T-Rex was big and slow. Its arms were useless for grabbing prey. Its bulk made ambush and stealth nearly impossible. But the evidence against the scavenger hypothesis is overwhelming, and today the field has largely settled the question. T-Rex was a hunter, and a very good one. The forward-facing eyes, achieve depth perception, are completely unnecessary for an animal that only eats things that are already dead. The olfactory system was far more powerful than needed for simple scavenging. And most definitively, we have found healed bite marks from T-Rex teeth on the bones of prey animals. Healed, meaning the prey animal was bitten, survived, and lived long enough for bone tissue to grow back over the wound. You cannot heal a bite wound if you were already dead when you were bitten. T-Rex bit living animals. T-Rex hunted. There is something almost poetic about the combination of qualities in T-Rex. Slow enough that a healthy adult human might escape it in a sprint, but possessed of a nose that could smell you from miles away, eyes sharp enough to see you from a great distance, ears tuned to hear your heartbeat, and the patience to follow you for hours without rest. It was a predator built not for the quick chase, but for the inevitable, relentless conclusion. You could run from a T-Rex, you just could not run forever. Chapter 9. The Predators. Nobody talks about. T-Rex gets all the attention. It always has. But the prehistoric world was full of extraordinary predators that history has largely passed over in favor of their more famous contemporary, and some of them were stranger, more impressive, and in certain ways more terrifying than T-Rex ever was. Spinosaurus is perhaps the greatest example of a remarkable animal that has been consistently underrated by popular culture. It was discovered in Egypt in 1912 by a German paleontologist named Ernst Stromer, and the original fossil bones were sent to a museum in Munich. Then, in 1944, during the Second World War, an Allied bombing raid destroyed the Munich Museum, and the original Spinosaurus fossils were burned to ash. For decades, the animal existed only in old notes and drawings, a ghost in the fossil record. Then new material started coming out of Morocco and Egypt, and what it revealed was unlike anything anyone had expected. Spinosaurus was longer than T-Rex, possibly 15 meters or more, making it potentially the largest predatory dinosaur that has ever been found. But the truly astonishing thing was not its size, it was its lifestyle. Spinosaurus was semi-aquatic. It lived in and around rivers and waterways, and its entire body was specifically adapted for life in the water in ways that make it almost unique among large predatory dinosaurs. Its bones were unusually dense for a dinosaur, a trait seen in modern semi-aquatic animals like penguins and hippos, where the added bone density helps with buoyancy control in water. Its hind legs were shorter than those of typical theropods, suggesting it moved more on all fours than on two legs, particularly in shallow water. Its feet showed signs of being partially webbed. Its skull was long and narrow, almost exactly like a crocodile's, with conical teeth perfectly designed for catching slippery fish. And on its back ran an enormous sail of bone and tissue, possibly used for display, possibly for temperature regulation. Spinosaurus was essentially a creature that no prior model of dinosaur biology had predicted. The largest predatory dinosaur that we know of was not stalking herds of plant-eaters across open plains. It was wading through ancient rivers, catching enormous fish with its crocodile jaw, and living a life more similar to a giant heron or a grizzly bear than to the land-based predators it superficially resembles. It is one of the most beautifully strange animals in the fossil record, and it deserves far more wonder than it gets. Then there was Utahraptor, the animal that the movie Velociraptors were actually supposed to be. The real Velociraptor, the one in the actual fossil record, was about the size of a turkey. Not particularly scary. But Utahraptor, discovered in Utah and named in 1993, was something very different. 6 meters long, over 500 kilograms, built for both speed and raw power, and equipped with a sickle-shaped killing claw on each foot that was 22 centimeters long, longer than a large human hand, curved like a hunting knife and razor-sharp. That claw was not used for slashing, as movies typically show. Current biomechanical analysis suggests it was used to pin prey to the ground, to hold a struggling animal in place while the raptor used its arms, jaws and body weight to finish the kill. It was an anchoring device, a grappling hook. And with an animal the size of Utahraptor on the other end, it was devastatingly effective. There is a fossil site in Utah that tells one of the most dramatic stories in all of paleontology. Several Utahraptor individuals were found together in proximity to a large sauropod carcass, all of them preserved in the same layer of sediment, all of them apparently killed at the same time. The sediment they died in shows characteristics of a semi-liquid quicksand-like material. They had been caught in a trap, lured perhaps by the smell of the sauropod carcass, and could not escape. The best reading of the evidence is this: a large sauropod had died in or near a quicksand-like sediment. Its smell attracted a group of Utahraptor. They moved in to feed. The ground gave way beneath them. They sank, struggled, and died alongside the prey they had come to scavenge. All of them, predators and prey alike, preserved together in the mud for 120 million years. Even the most formidable hunters of the ancient world could be outsmarted by geology. And then there were the great predators of the southern hemisphere. Giganotosaurus from Argentina and Carcharodontosaurus from North Africa. Massive theropods that rivaled T-Rex in size, but hunted prey that dwarfed even them. The giant sauropods that roamed those ancient southern lands. The evidence suggests these predators may have hunted in loose groups, not the coordinated strategic teamwork of modern wolf packs, but the opportunistic, chaotic mob behavior of several large predators converging on the same enormous prey simultaneously. Picture the chaos of that encounter. Multiple animals, each the size of a school bus, circling and charging and retreating around a prey animal the size of a building. The noise, the dust, the sheer, overwhelming scale of the struggle. It is one of the most dramatic scenes that has ever played out on this planet, and it happened with no audience, no record, and no memory. Only the bones in the rock remember it at all. Chapter 10. The Gentle Giants and the Grassless World. Not every chapter of the dinosaur story is about violence and predation. Most of it is not. Most of it is about something quieter, larger, and in its own way equally astonishing. The great plant-eaters and the world they shaped just by living in it. But before we can properly appreciate them, we need to clear up a misconception that affects almost every mental image people have of dinosaurs. Here is a fact that consistently surprises people when they first hear it. For most of the age of dinosaurs, grass did not exist. Not one single blade of it, anywhere on Earth. The grasses that cover most of the world's open land today. The prairies, the savannas, the plains, the lawns, the wheat fields and rice paddies that feed most of humanity, are actually a relatively recent development in evolutionary terms. Grass, as a family of plants, appeared very late in the Cretaceous period and only became truly widespread after the dinosaurs were gone. The open grassland ecosystems that we associate with large grazing animals, the African savanna with its herds of zebras and wildebeest, the American Great Plains with its bison, none of that existed during the age of dinosaurs. What existed instead was a world dominated by ferns, cycads, and primitive trees. Dense, ancient, low-light forests of species that have mostly vanished from the earth today. Towering conifers far older than any pine tree alive now, spreading tree ferns that filtered the strong Mesozoic sunlight into shifting patterns of green and gold. And through this world moved the sauropods, the long-necked, barrel-bodied, earth-shaking giants that represent the high-water mark of size in the history of land vertebrates. Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, Patagotitan. Animals so large that their passage through a forest was not just movement, but event. They did not merely eat the vegetation, they transformed it. When a herd of Brachiosaurus moved through a prehistoric forest, trees fell. Not because the animals were aggressive or destructive, but simply because their bodies occupied space that trees also occupied. Trunks snapped under the casual contact of massive legs. Canopies were stripped bare by long necks reaching effortlessly into heights that no other animal could access. The ground was trampled and compressed and churned by the repeated passage of animals that each weighed as much as a small fleet of cars. And behind them they left fertilizer. Enormous, constant, widely distributed fertilizer. A single large sauropod would have deposited hundreds of pounds of processed plant material every day, spread across the landscape as it walked. This fertilizer fed the soil, which fed the plants, which fed the sauropods. The animals were not just inhabitants of their ecosystem, they were architects of it, shaping the landscape as surely as any geological force. The question of why sauropods evolved such extraordinarily long necks has fascinated scientists for a very long time. The most widely accepted explanation is simple access. By raising their heads on these enormous necks, they could reach into tree canopies that were simply unavailable to any other animal. No competition. An exclusive food source that could sustain an enormous body with enough caloric density to justify the metabolic cost of maintaining the neck itself. But a secondary hypothesis adds another layer of interest. In many animals, secondary sexual characteristics, features that are expensive to grow and maintain, are used as signals of genetic quality to potential mates. The classic example is the peacock tail. It costs the peacock enormous amounts of energy. It makes him more visible to predators. It is, by pure survival logic, a terrible thing to have. And yet it persists because peahens prefer males with larger, more spectacular tails, and those preferences drive evolution as powerfully as predation does. Some scientists believe the sauropod neck had a similar dimension. The longer and more spectacular the neck, the more attractive the animal to potential mates, which would explain why some species pushed neck length well beyond what simple food access would require. A brachiosaurus neck was both a feeding tool and a display. Utility and beauty evolved together in one impossibly long curve of bone and muscle. There is something genuinely moving about this idea, that these enormous animals, creatures so large they seem to belong to a different scale of reality than the one we inhabit, were also, in their own ancient way, trying to be beautiful, trying to be noticed, trying to be chosen. Chapter 11. Nests, Parents and Baby Dinosaurs. In the summer of 1978, a rancher named Marion Brandvold was walking across her land in a rural stretch of Montana called Egg Mountain, and she noticed something sticking out of the exposed rock face near a dried-up stream. She called in a paleontologist named Jack Horner, who would later become one of the most influential dinosaur scientists of the 20th century, and what he found when he arrived changed the fundamental way that science understood these animals. It was not a skeleton, it was a nest, and inside the nest were baby dinosaurs. Not just one nest, dozens of them, clustered together in a remarkable ancient colony site, all belonging to a species of large plant-eating dinosaur called Maiasaura. The nests were bowl-shaped, roughly 2 meters across, carefully constructed from vegetation, and positioned at regular intervals from each other. Each nest separated from the next by approximately the body length of an adult Maiasaura. a spacing that is almost certainly not coincidence. But the most stunning detail was what the baby bones inside the nests revealed. Their teeth were heavily worn. Not the sharp, fresh, perfect teeth of animals that had just hatched and never eaten solid food. Worn down, heavily used teeth that showed clear evidence of sustained chewing over an extended period. These babies had been eating solid food while still in the nest, and since they were clearly too young and too small to go foraging for themselves, someone had been bringing food to them. Their parents had been feeding them, actively, regularly, over a sustained period. This single observation was revolutionary. Before Egg Mountain, the prevailing assumption in paleontology was that dinosaurs were more like modern reptiles in their parenting style. Lay the eggs, perhaps guard them briefly, and then leave the hatchlings to fend entirely for themselves from the moment they emerged from the shell. The idea of attentive, food-providing parental care was considered a mammal and bird thing, not a dinosaur thing. Egg Mountain proved that assumption completely wrong. Jack Horner renamed the species Maiasaura, which translates beautifully as good mother lizard, to honor what the fossil evidence had revealed about its behavior. And as more sites were excavated and analyzed, the picture that emerged was more and more remarkable. Maiasaura nested in colonies that may have contained thousands of nesting pairs simultaneously, creating vast, noisy, busy nursery grounds that would have been extraordinary to witness. The social organization implied by this is genuinely impressive. A colony requires collective decision-making about location. It requires each pair to maintain their individual territory within the communal space, while also sharing the collective protection benefits of numbers. It requires recognizing neighbors, managing disputes, and coordinating the constant activity of thousands of animals, all engaged in the same nesting cycle simultaneously. This was not simple automatic behavior. This was community. This was, in a very meaningful sense, a society. And Maiasaura was not unique. Evidence of nest building, egg tending and parental care has now been found across many different dinosaur lineages. Oviraptors, small crested theropods that were for decades wrongly accused of stealing other dinosaurs' eggs based on a misinterpreted fossil discovery, have been found in the classic brooding posture, sitting on their own eggs with their arms spread around the nest to protect and warm the clutch, exactly the way a modern bird broods. A posture so perfectly familiar that it makes the ancient world feel suddenly strangely close. And T-Rex babies. Let us talk about T-Rex babies because they are genuinely surprising in the most delightful way. A newborn T-Rex would have been covered in soft, fluffy, down-like feathers, small enough in its earliest weeks to fit in your arms. Its features would have been more delicate than its parents. Larger eyes relative to its face, a softer jaw, the proportionally oversized look that all baby animals share, and that triggers protective instincts across many different species. A baby T-Rex at the right age would have looked something like a very large, somewhat alarming baby bird. For its first several years, a juvenile T-Rex was actually a very different kind of predator than its parents. Smaller and lighter, it was faster and more agile, better suited to chasing smaller prey at speed, filling a different ecological niche than the adults. This meant that juvenile and adult T-Rex were not really competing with each other for food, which allowed both to thrive simultaneously in the same environment. Then came adolescence. Between roughly the ages of 14 and 18, T-Rex went through a growth spurt that has almost no parallel in vertebrate biology. The animal gained thousands of pounds over just a few years, its skeleton transforming from the light, swift architecture of a juvenile into the massive, reinforced structure of the adult. Muscles expanded, bones thickened, the jaw grew into the powerful bite machine that we have been describing. Before that transformation, a teenage T-Rex was a fast, agile, mid-sized predator. After it, the same animal was the most powerful land predator in the history of the world. The same creature, barely recognizable as the same creature. Growing up, even 65 million years ago, was a remarkable process. Chapter 12. Migration, herds and long journeys. One of the most powerful discoveries in recent dinosaur science involves not individual animals, but vast numbers of them moving together, and the growing evidence that many dinosaur species undertook large-scale migrations across the ancient landscapes of their world. In a region of Alberta, Canada, called Dinosaur Provincial Park, paleontologists have been studying a type of fossil site called a bone bed, a place where enormous numbers of bones from the same species are found together in a single layer of rock. These sites are striking enough on their own, but the bone beds of Centrosaurus, a large horned dinosaur related to Triceratops, are in a different category entirely. Some of these sites contain the bones of thousands of individual Centrosaurus, all preserved in the same geological layer, all apparently dying at roughly the same time. The story those bones tell is vivid and sad. The sediment they are buried in shows characteristics of rapid deposition in moving water. The kind of sediment pattern you get when a river floods suddenly and powerfully. The bones are jumbled and scattered in ways consistent with animals carried and deposited by fast-moving water. The overwhelming conclusion is that these thousands of Centrosaurus were crossing a river in flood conditions during a migration, and the river killed them, swept them away, drowned them, and deposited their bones together in the same catastrophic layer. The sheer numbers involved are almost incomprehensible from a modern perspective. We are accustomed to thinking of wild animal herds as belonging to the realm of Africa. The enormous wildebeest migrations of the Serengeti, the vast congregations of caribou in the far north. But the Centrosaurus herds suggested by these bone-bed sites were potentially of a comparable scale, tens of thousands of animals moving together across the ancient floodplains of what is now Canada. And migration implies so much more than just movement. It implies memory. An animal that migrates must know where it's going. It must have a destination, a route, a sense of direction across distances that far exceed the individual's immediate sensory range. Modern migratory animals use a remarkable variety of navigation tools. The Earth's magnetic field, the position of the sun, star patterns on clear nights, landmark recognition built up over years of experience. Birds, in particular, have a form of magnetic sensing so sophisticated that they can essentially see the planet's magnetic field lines and use them as a built-in compass. If dinosaurs shared similar neural machinery, and there is good reason to believe that theropods in particular had brains capable of this kind of spatial processing, then they were navigating the ancient world with an internal precision that most people would never think to credit them with. They knew where they were. They knew where they were going. They had been there before, and they were going back. The social dimension of migration is also worth considering carefully. An animal travelling with thousands of others of its own species must recognize its companions, or at least its immediate group, as distinct from rivals or strangers. It must coordinate movement, respond to distress signals from nearby individuals, and maintain its position in the herd over days or weeks of continuous travel. None of this is possible without a level of social cognition that was, until relatively recently, considered completely foreign to dinosaurs. We picture them as solitary or at most loosely aggregated. The evidence says otherwise. Many dinosaurs were deeply social creatures, with group identities and shared destinations, and the kind of collective behavior that requires genuine awareness of other individuals as individuals. Not just shapes moving nearby, but known companions. Fellow travelers in the deepest sense. Chapter 13. The Strangest Dinosaurs That Ever Lived. We have spent a lot of this story talking about the famous dinosaurs, the ones every schoolchild knows by name. But some of the most extraordinary creatures in this story are the ones that barely make it into the popular imagination, and they deserve their moment in the light. Because evolution, left to its own devices for hundreds of millions of years, produces things that no human mind could invent. Things so strange that when scientists first found them, the reaction was often simple disbelief. Consider Therizinosaurus. It was a large dinosaur from Central Asia, and when the first fossils were found in Mongolia in the 1950s, the scientists who found them genuinely did not know what to do with them. What they had found were claws. Enormous, curving, sickle-shaped claws, each one nearly a metre in length, longer than any human arm. The entire arm span of the animal was almost 3 meters across. These were the most formidable-looking weapons ever attached to a living body, more dramatic than the claws of any predator that has ever walked the earth. Scientists assumed, naturally, that they had found the most terrifying predator that had ever existed. They were completely wrong. Therizinosaurus was a plant-eater. Those magnificent, terrifying claws were used to pull branches down within reach of its long neck, stripping the leaves off and guiding vegetation toward its mouth. The most alarming set of natural weapons in the history of life on Earth belonged to an animal that was essentially a very large and somewhat anxious vegetarian. Evolution does not read the script we write for it. Then there is the remarkable case of Dinosaurus, which for nearly 50 years was one of the great mysteries of paleontology. In 1965, a Polish-Mongolian expedition was working in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia when they found something extraordinary in the rock. 2 enormous arms. Just the arms. Each arm was 2.5 meters long, that is over 8 feet, and ended in large, powerful, hook-like claws. No body, no head, no legs, just arms, standing alone in the ancient sediment like a monument to something unknown. The arms were so large, so structurally unusual, so unlike anything in the known fossil record, that scientists genuinely could not determine what kind of animal they belonged to. For almost 5 decades, Dinosaurus, whose name means terrible hand, was represented in the scientific literature as nothing more than a pair of arms attached to a question mark. Children and adults alike stared at those arms in museums and felt a particular kind of unease, the unease of incompleteness. What was the rest of it? In 2014, almost a century after the first expedition that found those arms, more complete material was finally discovered. And the full animal was revealed to be one of the most bizarre creatures that has ever lived on this planet. Dinosaurus was enormous, 12 to 13 meters long. It had a duck-like bill similar to the hadrosaurs, though it was not closely related to them. It had a distinctive hump along its back, somewhat like a camel. It had a body shape that combined elements of multiple different animal types in a way that seemed almost randomly assembled. It ate fish and plants. It lived near ancient rivers and lakes. And those famous arms were used for digging in shallow water and pulling vegetation. It was, in the most affectionate possible sense, a completely ridiculous animal. And it was real, and it lived, and it was part of the same world as T-Rex and Triceratops and Velociraptor. Evolution has a magnificent sense of humour. Pachycephalosaurus is another creature that deserves careful attention. Its name means thick-headed lizard, and it earned that name honestly. Pachycephalosaurus had a dome of solid bone on top of its skull that was up to 25 centimeters thick. That is roughly the thickness of an adult human's entire head, in solid bone, sitting on top of the animal's actual skull, like a permanent helmet. For many years, the obvious interpretation was that these animals used their domes to headbutt each other, the way bighorn sheep and musk oxen do today. 2 males charging toward each other, heads lowered, meeting in a collision of solid bone. The image was so intuitive and so dramatic that it became canonical. More recent biomechanical analysis has complicated this picture significantly. Scientists calculated the forces involved in a direct head-to-head collision between 2 adult Pachycephalosaurus and determined that the impact would have been severe enough to cause catastrophic injury to both animals, even through that thick dome. Natural selection does not typically favor behavior that reliably damages the animals performing it. The current best hypothesis is that Pachycephalosaurus used its domed head to ram into the flanks of rivals. A lateral impact rather than a head-on collision, aimed at the softer sides of the body rather than another armoured dome. Think of it less like 2 rams headbutting and more like a battering ram striking a wall sideways. The dome was a weapon, but a smarter one than the old image suggested. And then there is Nigersaurus, which is arguably the most specialized feeder in the history of vertebrate life. Its skull was unlike anything else ever found. The jaws were wide, flat, and squared off at the front like a lawnmower attachment. Inside those jaws, arranged in tight rows like a conveyor belt, were over 500 individual teeth. When the front row wore down, which happened quickly for an animal constantly grazing tough vegetation, the next row rotated forward to replace them. The whole system was essentially a self-replacing dental belt. The skull of Nigersaurus was also extraordinarily lightweight, more window than wall, with enormous openings that reduced the bone to a delicate lattice. And the entire shape of the skull and neck was configured for one specific posture. Head down, sweeping from side to side at ground level, cropping ferns and low plants in a continuous methodical sweep. Nigersaurus probably could not raise its head to look straight ahead. It could not reach into trees. Its entire biology was optimized with beautiful narrow precision for a single task, cutting low-growing vegetation with maximum efficiency and minimum effort. It had found its place in the ancient ecosystem and evolved into that place so completely that it could not have done anything else. There is something both strange and deeply recognizable about that specialization. Most of us understand on some level what it's like to be shaped by a single purpose. Chapter 14: Dinosaurs and Disease, Injuries and Survival. Of all the things that make ancient life feel suddenly close and real, perhaps nothing is more effective than the evidence of illness. Because disease is universal. It does not care about the age of the world, or the size of the body, or the number of years since the last ice age. Disease is the same in a dinosaur as it is in a human, in the fundamental sense that the body suffers, and the animal must find a way to continue living despite that suffering. And the fossil record, read carefully, is full of suffering. It is also, more importantly, full of survival. In the year 2020, a team of scientists published a study examining the vertebrae of several Tyrannosaurus rex individuals and found something that was both sad and astonishing. Embedded in the bone of multiple individuals were clear signs of a disease called septic arthritis, and in some cases what appeared to be an aggressive form of bone cancer. Tumours growing directly within the vertebral bone tissue, not around the bone, inside it. These animals were living with cancer. They were hunting with cancer. They were doing everything that survival required, tracking prey, pursuing quarry, processing kills, defending territory, while a disease was actively destroying their own bone structure from within. And some of them, based on the extent of bone remodeling around the affected areas, survived for considerable periods after the disease began. The courage implied by this, and we use that word carefully, knowing it is a human concept applied to an animal that had no language and no understanding of what was happening inside its body, is nonetheless real. The continuation, the persistence, the refusal to stop. There is also the famous Triceratops that got into a fight with a T-Rex. We know this not from any witness, obviously, but from a remarkable fossil. The hip bone of a Triceratops individual shows a set of healed bite marks, not fresh bite marks. Healed ones, meaning the bone shows regrowth tissue, which can only form in a living animal's body. This Triceratops was bitten hard through the hip by something with bite marks consistent with a T-Rex, and then survived. The wound began to heal. The animal lived on, carrying the scar of that encounter in its bone for however long it had left. A triceratops was attacked by the most powerful land predator in the history of the world, took a direct bite through its hip from jaws capable of crushing solid bone, and walked away. That is not a minor detail. That is one individual animal's particular story of resilience, preserved by pure geological luck for 66 million years, waiting for a human scientist to read it. The growth rings inside dinosaur bones. Those annual records of development that were exactly like tree rings tell individual life stories in extraordinary detail. Scientists can read them to determine not just an animal's age at death, but the quality of each year of its life. Years with widely spaced rings were good years. The animal was healthy, well-fed, growing rapidly. Years with tightly spaced or interrupted rings were hard years. Drought, disease, injury or food scarcity had stressed the body and slowed growth. What emerges from these records is a portrait of lives that were genuinely difficult. Not uniformly dramatic and violent, the way movies depict them, but grindingly, quietly hard in the way that life for most wild animals always is. There were good seasons and bad seasons. There were injuries that healed and injuries that did not. There were animals that lived long, full lives and animals that died young. And in the bone, if you know how to read it, all of those individual stories are still there, waiting. Chapter 15. The day the world ended. 66 million years ago, on a morning in what was probably late spring in the northern hemisphere, the world of the dinosaurs was going about its business exactly as it had for the previous 165 million years. Hadrosaurs were calling from river valleys. Sauropods were moving through ancient forests, pulling branches down with their long necks. Small feathered theropods were hunting insects in the undergrowth. Somewhere on the Yucatan Peninsula of what is now Mexico, the shallow sea that covered much of that region was glittering in the morning sun. And then something appeared in the sky. The object that ended the age of non-avian dinosaurs was roughly 10 to 15 kilometers across, roughly the width of a small city. It was moving at approximately 20 kilometers per second, which is about 40 times the speed of a bullet. It had been traveling through empty space for billions of years on an orbital path that had been laid down by the mechanics of the early solar system, and by pure mathematical coincidence, that path led to the surface of the Earth, and specifically to the shallow carbonate rocks of the Yucatan. When it hit, the energy released was so enormous that the numbers become almost meaningless. Scientists estimate it was equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. The impact created a crater 180 kilometers wide. The rock beneath the point of impact was not just shattered. It was liquefied, then instantly vaporized, then blown outward in an expanding ring of destruction that flattened everything within hundreds of kilometers. But the animals near the impact site were not the ones whose extinction matters most to this story. Those animals died instantly, and their deaths were merciful in their speed. What matters are the animals on the other side of the planet, in places where the ground did not shake and the sky did not turn to fire, who had no idea what had just happened and who were about to experience the consequences over the next months and years. The debris thrown into the atmosphere by the impact, vaporized rock, dust, soot from the wildfires that ignited across the globe, spread through the upper atmosphere with extraordinary speed. Within days, a dark, reflective layer of particles circled the entire planet, blocking sunlight with terrifying efficiency. Photosynthesis stopped. This is the most devastating 4 words in the story of the extinction. When plants cannot photosynthesize, they die. When the bottom of the food chain dies, everything above it follows in sequence. Herbivores starve. Carnivores starve after them. The ocean food chains, dependent on photosynthetic plankton, collapse from the base up. The land food chains, dependent on green vegetation, collapsed simultaneously. And then the cold came. Without sunlight, global temperatures dropped sharply. A world that had been warm and lush for millions of years. A world with no polar ice caps. A world where forests grew near the poles, was plunged into a prolonged, deep winter. Snow fell in places that had never known winter. Rivers froze. The last of the starving herbivores had nothing to eat and nowhere warm to go. The creatures that survived shared a few critical characteristics. They were small enough that their bodies did not require massive amounts of food to sustain basic function. They were generalists, capable of eating a wide variety of food types, so that when one food source disappeared, they could switch to another. And many of them could shelter in places protected from the worst extremes. Underground, in deep water, in burrows and crevices where temperature and conditions were more stable. The large, specialized, surface-dependent animals, the massive dinosaurs that required hundreds of pounds of food daily, the pterosaurs that could not shelter from the temperature extremes, had no path through. Not because they were weak or poorly designed. They were extraordinary animals that had been perfectly adapted to their world for millions of years. They died because their world was instantly, catastrophically changed in ways that no amount of individual excellence could overcome. In the rock that was laid down 66 million years ago, there is a layer found at sites all over the world, on every continent, at the bottom of every ocean, called the KPG boundary. It is a thin line of clay enriched with the element iridium, which is rare on Earth but common in asteroids. Below that line, dinosaur fossils are abundant. Above it, they vanish. That thin line of clay is the last page of one of the greatest stories ever told. Chapter 16. Dinosaurs are not extinct. Here is a sentence that will sound like an exaggeration the first time you hear it, but which is supported by the full weight of modern evolutionary biology, genetics, comparative anatomy, and paleontology. It is not a metaphor, and it is not a simplification. It is a precise, literal, scientifically accurate statement. Dinosaurs are not extinct. There are approximately 10,000 species of living dinosaurs on Earth today. You probably encountered several of them this morning. They are singing in the trees outside your window right now. They are perched on telephone wires and floating on ponds and diving into the ocean for fish. You have been feeding them breadcrumbs in the park your whole life. We just call them birds. This is one of those facts that sounds surprising because it challenges a word we thought we understood. When we say birds are dinosaurs, we do not mean they are descended from dinosaurs, the way mammals are descended from ancient mammal-like reptiles. we mean they are dinosaurs, in the same way that bats are mammals and salmon are fish. Taxonomically, phylogenetically, in terms of evolutionary lineage, birds sit inside the dinosaur family tree, specifically within the theropod branch. They are not the cousins of dinosaurs. They are not the successors of dinosaurs. They are a currently living group of dinosaurs. The evidence for this comes from every direction simultaneously. The skeleton of a bird, stripped of its feathers and examined carefully, is recognizably the same basic structure as a theropod dinosaur skeleton. The three-toed feet, the hollow bones, the wishbone, which is formed from the same anatomical structures as the theropod clavicle, the respiratory system of air sacs that extends through hollow spaces in the skeleton. All of these features connect birds to theropod dinosaurs in a chain of evidence so complete and so consistent that there is simply no credible scientific argument against it. When scientists were able to extract protein fragments from a T-Rex femur in 2007, a genuinely remarkable technical achievement, and then compare those proteins to modern animals, the closest match was not any living reptile, it was a chicken. Written in molecular biology, preserved in bone tissue for 65 million years, was a biological handshake between the most famous predator in prehistory and the most commonplace bird in modern American life. Think about what the birds around you have preserved from the dinosaur age. Every crow that picks up a piece of trash and figures out how to extract the food inside has a brain that shares deep structural similarities with theropod brains. Every hawk that drops from the sky at 150 miles per hour is using aerodynamic principles that were being refined by feathered dinosaurs for 50 million years before the asteroid arrived. Every songbird that builds a perfect, carefully constructed nest, lined with soft materials and maintained through incubation and feeding, is practicing a version of the parental care that Maiasaura practiced in Montana 80 million years ago. The hollow bones that make birds light enough to fly. They appeared in theropod dinosaurs long before any of those theropods could fly. The air sac respiratory system that makes birds so efficient at extracting oxygen, more efficient actually than mammalian lungs, was a feature of many dinosaurs, and it may partly explain how animals as large as sauropods could sustain their enormous metabolisms. The complex layered feathers that make flight possible were serving different functions in non-flying dinosaurs for millions of years before the first true flight evolved. Everything remarkable about birds is something that was first evolved by dinosaurs for other purposes, then inherited by a surviving lineage and eventually repurposed for flight. The sky was not conquered by a new innovation. It was conquered by creatures carrying millions of years of ancient dinosaur technology, finally combined in a configuration that let them leave the ground. And they never stopped. While the giant non-avian dinosaurs were erased by the asteroid, the small, feathered flying members of the lineage survived. They diversified. They spread to every continent, every climate, every ecological niche available. Today, they are the most species-rich group of land vertebrates on Earth. More species of birds exist today than species of mammals. More species of birds have been described by science than any other group of land animals. The dinosaurs did not lose. They adapted to the worst disaster in the history of animal life on this planet and came out the other side stronger in terms of species diversity than they had ever been before. When you watch a flock of starlings move across an evening sky in that extraordinary coordinated swirl that nobody fully understands, each bird responding to its neighbours in real time, the whole flock flowing like a single liquid organism, you are watching a 66-million-year-old lineage performing a behaviour that is as mysterious and beautiful as anything the ancient world ever produced. The next time you see a crow solving a puzzle, remember Truden. The next time you see a hummingbird hovering with impossible precision in mid-air, remember the feathered, agile hunters of the Cretaceous. The next time a chicken scratches in the dirt with those particular, recognizable three-toed footprints structurally identical to the ones that T-Rex left in soft Cretaceous mud, remember that you are watching a dinosaur. An honest-to-goodness, full biological, completely legitimate dinosaur. They never left. We just changed what we call them. Chapter 17. What new technology is revealing right now? For most of the 200 years that paleontology has existed as a formal science, it was essentially a craft. A skilled craft, practiced with enormous care and dedication, but fundamentally dependent on a small set of tools: the rock hammer, the dental pick, the careful brush, the trained eye. You found a bone. You described it. You compared it to other bones. You made educated inferences about the animal it belonged to, and you published your conclusions in a scientific journal where other scientists with other bones would agree or disagree. That model produced an extraordinary body of knowledge. Every major dinosaur we have discussed in this story was discovered and understood through those methods. But the last 20 years have brought a technological revolution to paleontology that has changed the depth and the specificity of what can be known from a fossil so dramatically that entire textbooks are being rewritten in real time. We are living through a golden age of dinosaur science, and the pace of discovery is accelerating rather than slowing down. The most widely used new technique is something familiar to anyone who has spent time in a hospital: the CT scanner. The same machine that allows doctors to see inside human bodies without surgery can be used on fossil bones to reveal their interior structure with extraordinary precision. A dinosaur skull run through a medical CT scanner produces a three-dimensional digital map of every cavity inside the bone. Every sinus, every nerve canal, every blood vessel impression, every internal structure that would normally be invisible without cutting the fossil apart. From a CT scan of a skull alone, scientists can now reconstruct the approximate size and shape of the brain, including the relative development of different brain regions. They can estimate the sensitivity of different senses, which brain regions related to smell, vision, hearing, and balance were large or small. They can infer aspects of behavior and intelligence from the neural architecture, and they can do all of this without removing a single gram of material from the fossil, preserving it intact for future researchers with even better technology. This has produced a wave of brain reconstructions called endocasts, for dinosaur species that have been known for 100 years, but whose neurology was entirely unknown. Animals that had been described only in terms of their bones are now yielding secrets about their inner lives from the same fossils that have been sitting in museum drawers since the Victorian era. The protein work is equally remarkable. As mentioned earlier, the extraction of protein fragments from T-Rex bone tissue in 2007 was a landmark moment in paleontology. But it was not a one-time event. Since then, researchers have developed increasingly sophisticated methods for identifying and extracting ancient proteins from fossil material, working carefully to distinguish genuine ancient biological molecules from contamination. Each successful extraction adds another data point to the molecular family tree of dinosaurs, a way of mapping evolutionary relationships that complements and in some ways exceeds what bone shapes alone can tell us. DNA, as we noted before, is beyond current reach for animals as old as the dinosaurs. The chemistry of DNA is too fragile to survive for tens of millions of years in even the best preservation conditions. But proteins are more durable, and the field of ancient protein analysis, paleoproteomics, is advancing rapidly. The amount of biological information that can eventually be extracted from the fossil record, given continued technological progress, is genuinely difficult to predict. It may be more than most scientists currently imagine. Ground-penetrating radar is another technology that is transforming fieldwork in ways that are quietly revolutionary. This technology, originally developed for engineering and military applications, can be used to scan beneath the surface of fossil sites and produce images of what lies in the rock below without disturbing a single layer of sediment. When a paleontologist arrives at a promising outcrop and wants to know whether extensive excavation is likely to produce significant finds, they can now get a preliminary answer without committing months of labor. The implications of this are enormous. Some of the most significant fossil sites in the world have been found by walking over ground and noticing surface exposures. Ground-penetrating radar means that every previously surveyed fossil site in the world is worth reconsidering, because there may be fossils lying just below the surveyed surface that nobody knew were there. In one documented case, a site in Utah that had been thoroughly excavated and considered fully explored was scanned with ground-penetrating radar and found to contain an extensive fossil bed several meters below the worked-out surface layer. Hundreds of additional specimens, unsuspected, unexcavated, waiting. The site paleontologists had thought they understood completely was only the tip of something much larger. This is happening at sites around the world. The fossil record is far richer than we know, and the tools to access it are improving every year. We are not at the end of the age of discovery. We are somewhere in the early middle of it. Chapter 18. Could dinosaurs ever be brought back? It is impossible to talk about dinosaurs for any length of time with an American audience without eventually arriving at the question that a series of extremely successful movies turned into one of the most famous scientific hypotheticals of the 20th century. Could we bring dinosaurs back? Could we clone them, grow them, release them into a park, and watch what happens? The honest scientific answer is worth taking seriously, because it is more nuanced and more interesting than a simple yes or no. The specific method depicted in the Jurassic Park movies, extracting ancient dinosaur DNA from the blood of mosquitoes preserved in amber, is not possible. Not currently possible. Not possible with any technology we can currently imagine. And the reason has to do with the fundamental chemistry of DNA. DNA is a molecule, and like all molecules, it degrades over time. The process is slow in cold, dry, oxygen-free conditions, but it is relentless. Scientists have worked out the approximate half-life of DNA under typical preservation conditions and concluded that after roughly 6 to 7 million years, DNA has fragmented into pieces too small and too damaged to provide useful genetic information. The youngest non-avian dinosaurs lived 66 million years ago. That is approximately 10 times beyond the theoretical maximum age for recoverable DNA. Amber is not an exception to this rule. Although amber is an excellent preservative for external features, shape, color, even microscopic surface structures, the biological molecules inside an insect preserved in amber are exposed to chemical processes that degrade DNA just as surely as any other environment. No intact ancient DNA has ever been reliably extracted from amber specimens, and multiple supposed claims of such extraction have not been replicated and are not considered credible by the scientific community. But here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the impossibility of direct cloning does not close the door on the broader question. It just redirects it. If birds are living dinosaurs, and we have established beyond any reasonable doubt that they are, then the genetic information of dinosaurs is not entirely lost. It is present, transformed and modified by 66 million years of evolution in every bird alive today. The specific sequences that made a bird, rather than its theropod dinosaur ancestors, were activated or deactivated at various points during the evolutionary history of the lineage. Genes that were expressed in theropods but are now silenced in birds. Developmental programs that built dinosaur features but were switched off as the lineage evolved toward modern avian form. A scientist named Jack Horner, the paleontologist who discovered the Maiasaura nesting sites in Montana that we discussed earlier, and one of the inspirations for the character of Alan Grant in the Jurassic Park films, has spent years pursuing what he calls the Chickenosaurus project. The goal is not to clone a dinosaur, and never was. The goal is to selectively reactivate dormant ancestral genes in chicken embryos to recover dinosaur-like features in the resulting animal. This is not science fiction. It is being done carefully and incrementally in laboratories right now. Researchers have already partially succeeded in coaxing chicken embryos to develop elongated dinosaur-like snouts rather than beaks by manipulating the molecular signals that control facial development. Scientists have reactivated the genetic program for developing a long dinosaur-like tail in chicken embryos, rather than the shortened fused structure of modern bird tails. Researchers have induced the development of dinosaur-like hand structures in chicken embryos by modifying the genetic switches that control limb development. None of these modified embryos have been hatched. The research is in early stages, and the scientific and ethical considerations of creating living chimeras are serious and ongoing. But the point is demonstrated. The genetic information for dinosaur features has not been deleted from the avian genome. It has been silenced, and silenced genes can, in principle, be reawakened. What would emerge from a fully realized reverse engineering program is almost certainly not anything like a Jurassic Park dinosaur. It would be a chimera, something with features of both modern birds and their theropod ancestors, a creature that fits no existing category. It would not be T-Rex. It would not be Velociraptor. It would be something new and strange, carrying ancient information in a modern body. Whether we should do this, even if we can, is a different question entirely, and a serious one. The welfare of an animal that does not fit any existing ecological niche. The impossibility of providing it with the social, physical and behavioral environment its ancient biology requires. The ethical obligations that come with intentionally creating a new kind of life. Science can ask whether something is possible. That is its job, and it is very good at it. But the question of whether something should be done requires a different kind of thinking. Slower, more careful, more humble about consequences that cannot be calculated in advance. The wisest answer to the question of bringing back dinosaurs might be this. Before we ask whether we can, let us make very sure we understand why we want to. Chapter 19. What dinosaurs teach us about time. There is a perspective shift that happens when you spend enough time thinking seriously about dinosaurs, and it is one of the most disorienting and ultimately enriching experiences that deep history offers. It is the perspective shift that comes from genuinely trying to understand geological time. Not just the numbers, but the reality behind the numbers. Dinosaurs existed for 165 million years. That is the span from the first Eoraptor in the Triassic to the last T-Rex in the Cretaceous. Modern humans, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, meaning people essentially identical to you and everyone you have ever met, have existed for approximately 300,000 years. 165 million years is 550 times longer than 300,000 years. This means that if you compress the entire age of dinosaurs into a single calendar year, January 1st through December 31st, human beings would appear at about 11:30 in the evening on December 31st. The whole of human history, from the first stone tools and campfires to the pyramids of Egypt, to ancient Rome, to the Renaissance, to the Industrial Revolution, to the Internet, to right now, this moment, as you watch this video, all of that would take place in the last 30 minutes of the year. And in those last 30 minutes, we have built cities and written symphonies and sent spacecraft beyond the solar system and decoded the human genome and produced art of astonishing beauty and committed acts of astonishing destruction and wondered endlessly and earnestly about our own place in the universe. The dinosaurs had 550 times longer than that. 550 years for every year we have existed. And what did they do with it? They survived. They diversified. They adapted to every climate and every ecological role available to them. They filled the world so completely that 66 million years after most of their lineage was destroyed by the worst day in the history of animal life on this planet, their descendants still outnumber every mammal species on Earth. We tend to look at dinosaur skeletons in museums and feel a kind of comfortable superiority. They are gone. We are here. They did not make it through, and we did. The implication, rarely stated explicitly, but somehow always present, is that we are the goal, the destination, the answer to a question that the dinosaurs were just earlier drafts of. This is a profoundly mistaken view. Dinosaurs did not fail. They were not inferior drafts of something better. They were enormously successful animals that dominated this planet for a period of time so long that we cannot meaningfully imagine it. And they were ended not by any inadequacy of their own, but by a random, unforeseeable collision with a rock from space. Bad luck of cosmic proportions, nothing more. And the lesson of that bad luck, the one that tends to sit uncomfortably once you really absorb it, is this. No species, no matter how successful, no matter how dominant, no matter how perfectly adapted to its environment, is safe from catastrophic random chance. Extinction can arrive from outside any system, from sources that are completely independent of individual excellence or collective achievement or accumulated wisdom. This is not a comfortable lesson. It is, however, an important one. And it is perhaps the deepest thing that the age of dinosaurs has to teach us, if we are willing to hear it with honesty and without defensiveness. We are approximately 30 minutes into our year. The dinosaurs had all 12 months. And at midnight on their December 31st, through no fault of their own, the year ended. Our year is still going, and what we do with the time we have is entirely up to us. Chapter 20. The last fact, the one that changes everything. We made you a promise at the very beginning of this video. All the way back at the start, before the ancient supercontinent and the great dying and the feathered T-Rex and the singing Parasaurolophus and the strange arms of Dinosaurus, we promised you a final fact. A single fact that, once you hear it and really sit with it, will change the way you think about every dinosaur you have ever seen. Here it is. The gap in time between Tyrannosaurus rex and Stegosaurus is larger than the gap in time between Tyrannosaurus rex and us. Let that land for just a moment before we walk through it. Stegosaurus lived during the late Jurassic period, roughly 155 million years ago. T-Rex lived at the end of the Cretaceous period, roughly 66 million years ago. The difference between those two dates is 89 million years. Stegosaurus and T-Rex were separated from each other in time by 89 million years. The difference between T-Rex and the present day, the distance between the last living Tyrannosaurus and the moment you are experiencing right now, is 66 million years. 89 million is larger than 66 million, which means T-Rex is actually closer in time to us, to you, sitting here in the 21st century, than T-Rex was to Stegosaurus. Think about what this means for how we think about dinosaurs. In our minds, Stegosaurus and T-Rex belong together. They share museum halls. They appear on the same plastic play sets. They inhabit the same mental category, dinosaurs. Ancient, gone, part of the same distant past. But they were no more contemporaries of each other than we are contemporaries of the dinosaurs themselves. Stegosaurus was as ancient and unfamiliar to T-Rex as T-Rex is to us. If a T-Rex had somehow encountered the bones of a Stegosaurus, unlikely scenario, but follow the thought, those bones would have been just as old and just as mysterious to that T-Rex as T-Rex bones are to a human paleontologist today. We compress time, we flatten it, we look at the great span of the past and see it as one thing, old, distant, gone, rather than what it actually is, a series of equally real, equally complex, equally present moments, each as full of life and noise and individual stories as the present moment is. The age of dinosaurs was not a single moment in the past. It was 165 million years of distinct, separate, irreplaceable worlds, each one different from the last, each one containing creatures that had never existed before and would never exist again. Stegosaurus and T-Rex are no more the same world than Julius Caesar and the first astronaut on the moon are the same world. Every bone in every museum is not just a piece of an extinct animal. It is a record of a specific time and place that was just as real and just as unrepeatable as the time and place you occupy right now. A specific individual lived, had a particular life, with particular experiences, good seasons and bad ones, encounters survived and encounters that left marks in the bone. And then it died, and by extraordinary geological luck, some part of it survived to be found, lifted from the rock, studied, and placed in a case for you to look at. The bones in museums are not dead. They are the most permanent thing most of those animals ever produced. Their bones have outlasted the mountains they walk beneath. They have outlasted the rivers they drank from, and the forests they fed in, and every other animal that shared their world. They are still here, while everything else from that world has been transformed beyond recognition. The dinosaurs were not a prologue to the story of life on Earth. They were not a failed draft of something better. They were 165 million years of living history, as rich and complex and surprising as any period of time that has ever passed on this planet. They shaped the world we live in, the soil, the oil that powers our cars, the birds that wake us in the morning, in ways we are still discovering. And they are still here, in the deep hollow bones of a hummingbird, in the careful, deliberate gaze of a crow, in the prehistoric patience of a great blue heron standing absolutely still at the edge of a river, watching the water with eyes that carry the evolutionary inheritance of a lineage 230 million years old. The next time you are outside, the next time you look up and see a bird moving against the sky, its silhouette clean and precise against the blue, take a moment with it. Really look at it. Because you are looking at something that has survived an asteroid impact and a mass extinction and 66 million years of unrelenting evolutionary pressure, and it's still here, still flying, still calling, still carrying inside every cell of its body the ancient biological legacy of creatures so extraordinary that we are still, after 200 years of digging and studying and arguing, only beginning to understand them. The dinosaurs never left. We just forgot to look. This has been insane, jaw-dropping facts that you never knew about dinosaurs. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. We meant every word of it.